Hello there. So today, the objective for this lesson is to find angle measures using vertical angles, linear pairs, and angles at a point. First, we're going to talk about vertical angles. And vertical angles are two angles formed by intersecting lines that are equal measure. And they're usually like diagonal from each other. So just remember that and you'll be able to figure it out. Now, in this picture I have, you can see that 1 and 4 are vertical angles, 2 and 3 are vertical angles, 5 and 8 are vertical angles, and 6 and 7 are vertical angles because they're like diagonal from each other. And we'll get into why in like a couple minutes. And vertical angles are equal measure because they tie into linear pairs, and in a minute that will make sense. So just know that like if these two angles are like diagonal from each other, just know that they're like equal measure. They don't add up to 180 like linear pairs do, which we'll get into in a second, but they're equal measure. Linear pairs are two angles that sum up to 180 degrees, and these kind of like tie into vertical angles, as I mentioned a few seconds ago. So in this picture, 1 and 2 are linear pairs, 3 and 4 are linear pairs, 1 and 3 are linear pairs, and so are 2 and 4. This means that 1 and 2 add up to 180 degrees, and you can figure this out because we're given that angle 2 is 100 degrees, so that means that angle 1 is 80 degrees because 100 plus 80 is 180. And then since angle 4 is vertical to angle 1, and angle 1 is 80, and vertical angles are the same measure, that would mean that angle 4 is also 80 degrees. And since 2 and 3 are vertical, and vertical angles are equal measure, that would mean that angle 3 is 100 degrees like angle 2 is. So then 4 is 80, 3 is 100, and then 100 plus 80 equals 180. And linear pairs form a line, which is 180 degrees on one side, and then 180 degrees on the other. So to help you understand that, here's a picture I drew. It's of just a line, and then it shows 180 degrees on one side, 180 degrees on the other, and then a circle around it to show that it makes up 360 degrees, because linear pairs are kind of like half circles. So it's like you have your two angles, which add up to 180 degrees, which is just this part of the line, which makes up this half circle. Here's another linear pair example to kind of like help you understand it. So we have angles 3 and 4. And we're given that angle 3 is 110 degrees. And since 3 and 4 are a linear pair, that means they have to add up to 180 degrees. So if we're given that angle 3 is 110 degrees, you would subtract 110 from 180 and we get 70. And then the measure of angle 4 would be 70. And a way to check your work in case you're like worried that you're wrong is just to like add up the two angles that you get and make sure that they add up to 180 and nothing more than less. Lastly, we have angles at a point, which means all angles that sprout from the same point sum up to 360 degrees. In this figure here, we have A, B, and X. You can see that A is 90 degrees, given by the square, B is 120, and X, well, we don't know. So angle A is 90, angle B is 120, and we know that 120 plus 90 is 210 degrees. And to find X, all you have to do is subtract 210 from 360, and we get 150. So 120 plus 90 is 210, and then you subtract 210 from 360, and you get 150. And if you're worried that your answers are wrong, just make sure you always add up the total numbers that you get to make sure they add up to 360 so you don't get anything wrong. This is something really simple, but just to be sure that you don't get anything wrong, make sure that you add up all your numbers at the end. So 90, 120, 150, 360. Now, in this last example, we have an X shape, and we have angles 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're given that angle 1 is 80 degrees, so that you only need one angle to figure out the rest. So this whole shape is going to be 360 degrees, like the last problem. So we have that angle 1 is 80 degrees. Angle 2 is vertical to angle 1. And remember, vertical angles mean that they are the same measure. So we know that angle 2 is also 80 degrees. So we have angle 1 and angle 2 are both 80 degrees, which adds up to 160 degrees, which means that we have 200 left to work with because 200 plus 160 is 360. So we have 3 and 4 left, and those are also vertical angles like 1 and 2 are. Vertical angles means that they are the same measure. They have the same angle measure. So if we have 200 degrees left out of the 360, we can just divide 200 by 2, and we get 100 degrees. So that would mean the measure of angle 3 is 100 degrees, and the measure of angle 4 is 100 degrees. So then we have 100 plus 100 plus 80 plus 80 equals 360. 80, 80, 100, 100. Again, just make sure you add up all of your angles at the end to make sure that you have the right answer, because these are really simple problems, and there's no point in getting something wrong just because you made a little grammatical or mathematical error. And that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and goodbye.